Professor Adam Stabholtz. Professor Stabholtz graduated from the Hebrew University Hadassah School of Dental Medicine and has been numerously appointed to be the Dean of the Hebrew University Hadassah School of Dental Medicine. He has received many awards for his work in dentistry, for his outstanding contribution to dentistry and to its allied professions, and has published extensively in the dental literature. I would like Professor Adam Stabholtz to come and talk about us. He's going to talk about the School of Underground Medicine in the Warsaw Ghetto, a personal perspective, and I'm not going to disclose his connection. I'll let him do it.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to share with you the story of a personal revival of my father, Dr. Ludwig Stabholtz, of blessed memory. And it's from medicine at the Chista Hospital in the Warsaw Ghetto to medicine in Israel. This presentation was prepared by his children. I have an elder brother, a lawyer, and a younger sister, also a lawyer. But we also have some family members who are physicians, which we'll discuss later. And I'm the middle son of my father. He was born in Warsaw in 1911. He belonged to a well-known dynasty of physicians, including his uncle, Dr. Henryk Stabholtz, who was the director of the Chista Jewish Hospital in Warsaw before the war. You can read about this family in Korot, the Israel Journal of Ministry of History of Medicine and Science. Due to the limit of number of Jews accepted to faculties of medicine in Poland and to fulfill his dream to become a physician, Ludwig first enrolled in a biology degree, which he completed with excellence. Only then was he allowed by the authorities to continue to study medicine, which he completed successfully. Having finished his studies in the Faculty of Medicine in Warsaw in 1939, he began work as surgeon at the famous Chista Hospital in Warsaw. Professor Privas was mentioned here before, and my father and Professor Privas were classmates who finished the medical school in Warsaw just before the Second World War broke. This is the Chista Hospital before World War II. 1,490 beds, 147 physicians, 199 nurses, and 6 pharmacists. It was a very famous and big hospital, and many Jews were on the staff of this hospital. But patients were Jews and non-Jews. In Warsaw, just before the war, Warsaw had about 1 million residents. A third of them were Jews. Jews from Warsaw and other places were closed in a ghetto from 1940 to 1943. At times, there were about 450,000 people in the ghetto under conditions of shortage and terrible sanitation. About 30% of physicians in Poland were Jewish. From the beginning of 1942, 5,000 people died every month in the ghetto. When a typhus case was discovered, the whole building was quarantined for 6 weeks, and a sanitary policeman stood guard, allowing no one in or out of the building. This created hardships for the inhabitants. And these are actually pictures from the situation in those days. At first, the Germans did not allow any educational framework for the Jews in occupied Poland. Later, they authorized limited basic studies and professional training such as course on sanitation to fight epidemics. This was approved in May 1941 following negotiations between the Judenrat and the Gestapo. One reason for approval of the course was the Germans' fear that typhus outbreak in the ghetto might spread to the Aryan side of Warsaw. A placard at the entrance to the Warsaw Ghetto which says typhus entry and exit forbidden. The sanitation course was organized by Dr. Julius Zweibaum, who had taught in the medical faculty at the University of Warsaw before the war. Some claim that Dr. Ludwig Hirschfeld first proposed the idea. Another source names Professor Edward Lott, a lecturer in anatomy at the University of Warsaw, as one who suggested to the Judenrat to take advantage of permission for the sanitation course to teach medicine in the ghetto. Our father was Professor Lott's assistant and eventually became a physician and lecturer at the underground medical school in the ghetto. Professor Charles Roland, who wrote the book Courage Under Siege, and wrote about this, and Dr. Daniel Nadav, also from the Tel Aviv University, the underground medical school in Warsaw Ghetto, and the hunger study. It was published in Galileo, an article in Hebrew. This course turned into the underground medical school where 500 Jewish students imprisoned in the ghetto were able to continue their medical studies. When the Germans were making patrolling in the ghetto, in this school, there were always sanitation materials which were presented on the tables, and on the blackboard there were different formulas of sanitation materials. And when the Germans saw that, they understood that actually it's important for those who are sitting there and studying to study about this sanitation. But when the Germans patrol were going away, then immediately they went into study medicine. Professor Edward Lott, who was not known as someone who was in favoring Jews, to say gently, in the beginning, Professor Lott also initiated a secret meeting of the Council of the University of Warsaw, which decided to recognize some of the studies that took place in the ghetto. Professor Lott even smuggled preparations into the ghetto through our father to help the teaching of anatomy and histology. At the same opportunity, the university promoted several Jewish lecturers to professors. Our father included, who was only 31 years old, so they would be able to formally certify the students' grades. So the underground medical school in Warsaw Ghetto started in February 1941 and ended in June 1942, about 15 months of studying. Professor Lott, who was killed in 1944, he was killed in the Polish mutiny just before the end of the war against the Germans. He was a professor at the medical school in Warsaw, famous anthropologist and anatomist, member of the Polish Academy of Arts and Science. And this is from the book of Professor Charles Ronald, the Canadian physician and historian. One Polish lecturer, righteous among the nations, Professor Edward Lott, kept contact with his anatomy assistant at the University of Warsaw, Dr. Ludwig Stabholtz, who lived in the ghetto. Ludwig was from a well-known medical family. His uncle Henrik headed the surgical department of the branch of Chester Hospital that was partially moved into the ghetto. Henrik caught an infection at work and died in March 1941. Edward Lott, according to Stabholtz, in an interview with me, was the first to convince the Judenrat to take advantage of German permission to teach sanitation to open a medical school in the ghetto. He also called a secret meeting of the Faculty Council at the University of Warsaw, which decided to recognize the studies that took place in the ghetto. At the same opportunity, the university appointed several Jewish lecturers, and it was said before, and my father, who was only 31 years old, was one of them. And here you can see an original document, and I will read you from there, the medical school in Warsaw Ghetto. The following is a translation of possibly the sole original document to have survived the clandestine medical school in the Warsaw Ghetto. It is undated, typewritten sheet, the original belonging to Dr. Ludwig Stabholtz, in whose home I examined it and who translated it, a copy and so on. And you can see all the topics here on the left side, and on the right side, the teachers at that time who were teaching in this school. You can see here. And the document on the left said that Health Department course on sanitation and infectious diseases. This is to certify that Dr. Stabholtz is a lecturer in the sanitation and infectious diseases, the management in Warsaw. There are no data or names of students who attended the medical school in the ghetto. It is estimated that about 500 students took part in at least some of the courses during the 15 months of the school's existence. Only few survived deportation to Treblinka that started on July 22, 1942. It is estimated that about 50 survived and received certification for their studies. The underground medical school. Two questions are asked over and over again in relation to the story of the medical school. What motivated the teachers and the students? Why did the teachers and students put themselves at risk? There is within us some hidden power, mysterious and secret, which keeps us going, keeps us alive despite the natural law. If we cannot live on what is permitted, we live on what is forbidden. And this is from Chaim Kaplan. Quoted from the rare personal diary of Chaim Kaplan, written in Hebrew, describing the destruction of the Jews of Warsaw. The diary was discovered after the war. Our father survived the ghetto after the wave of deportations together with our mother of blessed memory, who was a theater nurse by profession. They met while working together at the Chista Hospital. Professor Lott risked his life to smuggle them out of the ghetto to the Aryan side, where he had prepared them a safe house. In the safe house, they were in danger of betrayal by the neighbors, so our parents fled to Lvov, where they joined up with the Polish army operating under command of the Red Army. They participated in the liberation of Warsaw from the Nazis, and after the war, Dr. Stabholtz was recognized as one of the best-known rehabilitation specialists in Poland. Professor Lott risked his life saving my father because he smuggled him out of the ghetto with false documents, and he put a cast on his healthy leg, convincing the Germans that he was working at the ghetto in favor and doing works for the Germans. This is why they let them go out from the ghetto. My mother, who had some Aryan look, she was able to go in and out, and she arranged an apartment outside the ghetto, but later on, as was said before, they went to Lvov because they were afraid. The neighbors knew that they are Jews and it was danger for them to stay there. This is the picture of my father with my mother, Miriam, a nurse at the Chista Hospital, and my father here is in the Polish Army uniform. While our father was working at the hospital in the Ghetto, a high-ranking SS officer was brought in with terrible back pain. His men commanded my father to treat him and to cure him on the spot. They threatened to kill him if the treatment would not succeed. Our father began to treat the officer, and despite his inexperience with back problems, understood that he must relieve the pressure on the spinal cord. With the help of suitable traction methods and after several hours of treatment, the Gestapo officer's condition began to improve, and he and his men left the hospital. Our father told us that on that night he made a vow that if his life would be saved, it would be devoted to researching diseases and problems of the spine. After the war, our father was offered a senior position in the Faculty of Medicine in Warsaw. As an ardent Zionist and due to his bitter memories of wartime events and almost destroyed the Jewish people completely, he rejected the offer, and our parents decided to leave Poland. My mother's was the only member of their large families who had survived the Holocaust, and they immigrated to the land of Israel with her and their 2 small children born after the war. In 1950, they immigrated to Israel on the passenger ship Galila to the immigrant absorption camp in Atlit. In 1951, our father was enlisted in the Israeli Defense Force Medical Corps to complete the medical officer's course. He then settled in the coastal town of Netanya and began to work as director of the Netanya Klalit Health Fund Surgical Clinic. 4 years after arriving in Israel, their youngest child, a daughter, Orit, was born. Alongside raising his family, our father's work focused on orthopedic research and treatment of diseases of the back. As part of his research and specialization in back patients, he developed a unique concept for treating back pain. Our father became famous in Israel and around the world for his extensive research on back problems and conservative treatment methods. He saw this as a coming full circle regarding his traumatic event in the ghetto with the Gestapo officer that put his life at risk. In 1991, he published a comprehensive book on spinal cord problems. It was dedicated to his teacher, Professor Lot, to whom he and his family owed their lives after surviving the Holocaust. Our father also invented Vertitrack, a revolutionary device to treat slip disc based on the treatment concept that he developed. In addition to his research for decades and into late life, he ran successful clinics in Netanya and Tel Aviv to treat back diseases. His treatment method is used in hundreds of clinics throughout the world. Thanks to our father's efforts, in 1996, Professor Lot received the Righteous Among the Nations title from Yad Vashem. His daughter-in-law visited Israel for the first time as guest of the Stabholtz family. Professor Lot's son was also a physician, the same age of my father at the time of the Second World War, and he, as Professor Lot himself, they were killed during the uprising of the Polish army against the Germans before the end of the Second World War. And here you can see the tomb of Edward Lot at the Powązki Military Cemetery and the stone commemorating Edward Lot in Warsaw. And the third physician from this family, Tadeusz, he was a student at the time that the war broke. He was younger, like 4 years younger than my father, and he was captured by the Germans, and he survived 7 different concentration camps. When he came to America, he was 48 kilos, a survivor, and he decided to write this book that you see here, Seven Hells. It was translated to Hebrew by the Ministry of Defense as a book that shows the will and the strength of a person who wants to be kept alive. Tadeusz went and became a physician in Ohio, in Akron, Ohio, and just before he died, he received the highest honor of the governor of Ohio. And of course, he and my father, when they were over 19 years old, they kept talking by Skype, and it was very emotional to see these two people keeping their contact and sharing their experiences. This is a picture of my father in a happy moment, at the age of 94, holding his first great-grandchild in Israel. And to us, at that time, he said that this is his highest, or the highest victory over the Nazis, to have a great-grandchild born in Israel. Our father died in 2007 at the age of 96. Two of his grandchildren are physicians. One is a physician at Ichilov Hospital, a urologist, and the other one is a physician at Rambam Hospital, internal medicine. And I would like to end this presentation quoting Steven Spielberg. What? Your mother? Sorry, it's very emotional. It is impossible to tell about the Holocaust, but it will be a sin not to try. Steven Spielberg. Thank you for your attention.
I had the honor of going to interview Professor Ludwig Stabholtz. I think it might have been a year and a half before he passed away at his apartment in Ramat Aviv. And just to give another example of how everything's connected and how we are all connected, the picture on the screen that Professor Stabholtz ended his presentation with is a picture of the mother of one of our speakers who will be speaking in this session, Michael Beigel. That was his mother in the picture, and Michael can tell us about it more, but that's how everything's connected. I was told I didn't introduce myself. I am Tessa Chelouche. I am a family physician for Kupat Cholim Klalit. That's my real job. But I am interested, and I've been learning and teaching and researching on the subject of medicine and the Holocaust for many, many years. And I'm proud to be a member of the Lancet Commission and have enjoyed immensely the last 2 days, especially with the students. We have 8 students from international places, and I think we were honored to have them. And we have a lot of work ahead of us because we firmly believe that this is what every healthcare professional student all over the world should hear. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. I have the honor and pleasure of introducing you to Professor Dan Michman, who is a Professor Emeritus of Modern Jewish History and the former chair of the Arnold and Leona Finkler Institute of Holocaust Research at Bar-Ilan University. He is also the head of the International Institute for Holocaust Research and incumbent of the John Neitman Chair in Holocaust Studies at Yad Vashem. Professor Michman, he has published incredibly widely, available in 13 languages all over the world on a broad range of topics, including regarding the Shoah, its historiography and representations, and its impact on Israel, world Jewry, and the Western world.
it's 11:45, so I can still say good morning to you all. Thank you for the introduction, Tessa. But first of all, I want to welcome you on behalf of the International Institute for Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem, and on behalf of Yad Vashem in general. We are very glad that that you came here over and are our guests. I welcome also, of course, those who are on Zoom and the rest of the audience beyond the members of the Lancet Commission. I'll read part of my paper and part I'll talk beyond the paper. And I would say you got already today an introduction from Professor Dreyfus. I'll bring in, I think, another aspect from the perspective of the conceptualization of the Holocaust. So the domain of medicine and the Holocaust, and I would add healthcare, is enormously broad, as you all know, and multifaceted. And it is intertwined with the issue of medicine and Nazism in general. It deals with people and institutions in the medical profession in Nazi Germany, whether Nazis themselves or others, with non-Jewish people and institutions in many occupied and satellite countries throughout the European continent and beyond, with Jews and their institutions in Nazi-controlled Europe and the interactions between them all, and of course with post-1945 repercussions. The subtopics within this domain include organizational aspects of medical services and research, personal careers of doctors and medical staff, and we just heard one such story, longue durée backgrounds of these organizations and individuals, whether social, academic, or conceptual, post-Holocaust trials and implications, the dimensions of perpetration, rescue, and resistance, factual knowledge about specific physical and mental diseases that spread during this period and that is often mentioned, medical, ethical, and religious challenges evoked by Nazi ideology and behavior during the Holocaust period and afterwards, and also the question of archaeology and suffering and much more. So these topics have been and are studied with various intensity by experts ever since the end of World War II. I belong to the considerable group of Holocaust scholars that did not do research on medicine or healthcare during this period at all. I'm an outsider, though one of my daughters is a director of a lab at the medical school of the Hebrew University, just at the other mountain here. But as a Holocaust historian interested in the entire body of historiography, written on this subject on the one hand, and in questions of conceptualization of the event, the Holocaust, what exactly is the core feature of this event, and what aspects should be included in our understanding and definition of this event. On the other hand, I will reflect on the place of medicine in the existing comprehensive depictions and conceptualizations of the Holocaust and suggest a certain corrective that will be a surprise towards the end. Okay. You'll get a present to take home. So some remarks on the historiography of medicine, Nazism, and the Holocaust, and it was mentioned already earlier today, as I said. But historical research on National Socialism, including the Holocaust and medicine, is not new, of course. The fact that medical theories and perceptions played a role in racism and eugenics, and consequently in the Nazi Weltanschauung and practices, was obvious already for contemporaries, but came to the fore from the legal and ethical perspective when a limited number of senior doctors, 12 actually, were tried in the so-called subsequent Nuremberg trials by the American occupation authorities, and afterwards in a limited number of additional but more low-key trials. This caused this issue to find its way into some immediate post-war period studies and publications that attempted to comprehend the Nazi phenomenon. The emphasis, however, was at the time on the criminality and the unhumaneness of the personalities involved, with a focus on the experiments carried out on concentration camp prisoners, especially in Auschwitz, which limited the discussion and prevented it from tackling broader conceptual aspects from the perspective of historical analysis, though it had certain implications from the perspective of ethics, of course. On the other hand, as most of the German doctors and administrators in the medical field during the Nazi era continued their lives after 1945 uninterrupted and even making apparently honorable careers, the topic was largely suppressed and marginalized in the public discussion and in perpetrator research in Germany from the end of the 1940s through the 1980s. And as German perpetrator research was dominant in research on Nazism in general, it impacted in limiting the extent of research into this topic in general. Consequently, it limited also the Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the coping with the past, in the German post-war discourse, with this topic in the world of medicine, both in and outside Germany. A young, well, not so young anymore, German historian, Nicholas Berg, who works in Leipzig, has shown how the senior scholars of the major institution that was established in West Germany to research the Nazi era, the Institute for Contemporary History, Institut für Zeitgeschichte in Munich, sided in the beginning of the 1960s with the former senior Nazi official Dr. Wilhelm Hagen, who had been the director of the health department in the city of Warsaw during the occupation, and whose policies towards and activities relating to the Warsaw Ghetto were uncovered by the Jewish survivor historian Josef Wolf. Hagen sued Wolf for including him among collaborators and the executors of Nazi policies, and asked for, and indeed received, academic backing from the senior historian of that institute. Human geneticist Ottmar van Verschuur, who had played an important legitimizing role for and carried out unethical medical transgressions during the Third Reich, achieved political whitewashing in West Germany and then successfully refashioned himself and made an impressive career up to the position of director of the Institute for Human Genetics at the University of Münster. These are only two examples of much broader phenomenon of smooth or almost smooth reintegration of Nazi-era medical perpetrators into post-war German society. Moreover, medical institutions that had been complicit in criminal activities, among them the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, which is now the Max Planck Institute, after the war renamed as Max Planck Gesellschaft, tried to block research into their Nazi-era activities. This situation hampered critical in-depth research into the topic of the role of the medical professions in the Nazi enterprise. A real breakthrough in research can be observed only in the 1980s, as far as I could see. In Germany, the political scientist, historian, and journalist Götz Ali, who is a kind of troublemaker in the historian fashion, but a very interesting personality, after having embarked on an in-depth research into the euthanasia project, which broke an unwritten taboo, a project that was not approved for funding by the by the Deutsche Forschungsgesellschaft, that is the institution to support research, the national institution, started the publication of a journal dedicated to health issues, Beiträge zur nationalsozialistischen Gesundheits- und Sozialpolitik. Of much importance was also the tiny book by the biochemist and professor of genetics at the University of Cologne, Benno Müller-Hill, Murderous Science, which was published first in German in 1984 and later translated into 7 languages. Next to these, several other studies on Nazi medicine were published in Germany in the second half of the 1980s. In the United States, Robert Lifton's 1986 book, The Nazi Doctors, triggered broad interest in the topic, not only among those interested in medical issues, and similarly was the case with Robert Proctor's, starting from 1988, Racial Hygiene, Medicine Under the Nazis. This development in the 1980s in the field of medical history of Nazi Germany did not happen by chance. It should be seen as part of the emergence of a larger generation of scholars, some of them young contemporaries during the Nazi period or born in the immediate post-war period, that criticized both the so-called intentionalist approach, which I will relate to in a moment, which had focused on the ideology and policies of Hitler and the Nazi elite, and the so-called functionalist approach that, although looking in also at the participation of lower echelons of the Nazi bureaucracy in the decision-making of the Nazi state, essentially focused on structures, ministries, organizations in a very impersonal mode. When names were mentioned, it was merely as epithets. The new generation of researchers had a more individualized approach and focused therefore much more on biographies, highlighting the roles and careers of a variety of personalities from all parts of society who were involved in the Nazi project: architects, environmental planners, corporate managers, and employees. In this broadening scope of research, the medical professions also drew new interests. Yet it would take the German Chamber of Physicians, the Bundesärztekammer, which represents the German medical profession, many more years before it decided to publicly apologize for the crimes carried out during the Third Reich by the members of the profession, individually and collectively. This happened only in May 2012, with the publication of the so-called Nuremberg Declaration. As for the Jewish dimension, as Miriam Offer has well surveyed and pointed out in her book about the medical services in the Warsaw Ghetto, and more so even in her PhD thesis, and parts were thrown out when it was turned into a book, a considerable number of Jewish survivor historians, some of them originally physicians, such as, who became later my predecessor at Bar-Ilan University, Professor Meir Mark Dvorzhetsky, a survivor from Vilna, also wrote studies about medical issues during the Holocaust, but these remained fragmented and occasional, and the interest in the topic declined after the first surge until the late 1980s, when interest started slowly to grow again. Yet only since the turn of the centuries, a real upsurge in research can be observed. The editors of an issue of the periodical of the Dutch Historical Society, which was dedicated to medical history, described the state of affairs in that field in general in the following words, and I quote: "In the past, writing medical history was principally the domain of the medical profession. But today it's mostly carried out by specialist historians. This has led to placing it in the political, social, and cultural context. Moreover, the use of specific historical methods offers new insights into the development of medical care. Specific political, cultural, and social positions and developments have been inextricably and mutually linked to medical developments." That's the end of the quote. The two observations mentioned by them apply also to the field, I think, of medical history of the Holocaust. Firstly, many partial studies on medicine and the Holocaust were and are still written by interested doctors, and some of them are with us here. Yet in the past two decades, professional historians, not to say that the medical doctors are not professionals, but professional historians have moved into this topic too. Secondly, regarding Nazism and the Holocaust, ideological, political, cultural, and social positions and developments were of the utmost importance in this context. They impacted immensely on the course of medical practices, which escalated from medical care to medical non-care, or more explicitly, to criminal medicine, as far as the perpetrator aspect is considered. And they impacted on health care in extremis as far as the Jewish aspect is considered. The integration of the two aspects, the perpetrator and the Jewish ones, is needed to enrich our understanding of the overall picture of medicine and the Holocaust and of the subtleties of the many sub-issues, and I think it is especially relevant for the Lancet committee. So I want now to talk a little bit about the place of medicine in comprehensive studies of the Holocaust. Though at a first glance perhaps unexpected, it is not by chance that research on the Nazi era, and especially on the Holocaust, has seen a dramatic upsurge as time proceeded. When I entered the field in the 1970s, I never expected that it would expand so much and it would be so vibrant as it is today. Within 2 weeks, a comprehensive overview and analysis of the state of research since the 1990s, which I wrote, will be published here at Yad Vashem. I hope that it would be ready for this meeting. It didn't happen, but it will be. Yet what I found, and while consulting the Yad Vashem library, is that since the year 2000, 78,000 books arrived in the Yad Vashem library, books on the Holocaust. From them, since 2009, close to 10,000 scholarly studies. And this is not mentioning the articles in periodicals, right? So you can see that the output on the Holocaust is enormous and actually impossible to have an entire precise picture of what is happening in the field. And but I would say that this upsurge is the result of the enigma that the Nazi era poses for the historian, the enormous and quick transition of a society, first the German and then the Austrian one, from a normal, even if troubled society, into a society that is at large participating in a collective project which transgressed all accepted moral norms, and then also succeeded in involving many other groups in society throughout Europe in that project. As French historian Johann Chapoutot has recently pointed out in a study that I think is very important, The Law of Blood, Thinking and Acting as a Nazi, was first written in French and was later also translated into German. German society turned into what is called a Kampfgemeinschaft, a community of battle, within a Darwinist worldview. And I will return to this understanding, trying to show that a large portion of the German medical profession joined this community of battle, and that this presents another facet of a needed reformulation and a redefinition of the Holocaust as a historical event. So comprehensive studies of the Holocaust, that is the attempt to present a comprehensive picture of this event in one book, are an important genre to be examined. These books, which are usually one-man syntheses of the overall pictures, are used as handbooks in university teaching, serve scholars who carry out partial studies, and are read by large audiences of interested lay people. Also, many of those researching medical issues during the Holocaust usually lean on them, or one or two of those studies, for getting the background, that is the general context. However, in most of these studies, the medical professions and healthcare are related to only on the very, very margins, are hardly mentioned. And they are often entirely ignored. That is, there are not topics that are considered to contribute any essential insight for the understanding of the entire event of the Holocaust. Of course, one will find a sporadic mentioning of certain medical issues that recur all the time, and that is the euthanasia program, Mengele, right? That's also in survivor memoirs. Everybody who arrived at Auschwitz was selected by Mengele, although he hardly was there. And there is the sterilization of Jews in mixed marriages, and so you have some things that are mentioned again and again in the context of the problems arising from the implementation of racial anti-Jewish policy. And of course, this is presented in the context of the phrase "life unworthy to live." So these issues are not unimportant, of course, and the interpretation of them are not incorrect. Yet they are only a flickering from the broad field of activities in the field of medicine during that period. And this observation is true for the whole series of comprehensive books that is usually used by Leon Polyakov from 1951, Gerald Reitlinger, 1953, Lucy Davidovich, 75, Leni Achil, 1990, Daniel Goldhagen, 96, Saul Friedlander, 97, the 2 volumes, 97, 2000, and some more recent ones by David Cesarani and Christian Gerlach from 2016. And also in the more popular books like one written by Yehuda Bauer in 1981 and so on. There are 2 exceptions where there is a little bit more about the aspect of medicine and the Holocaust, and that is in a book that almost fell into oblivion, the book by Joseph Tenenbaum, Race and the Reich, from 1956, and in Raoul Hilberg's influential book, The Destruction of the European Jews, which was first published in 1961 and then republished and extended all the time and translated and so also, but the basic conceptualization remained the same. And after, so Tenenbaum and Hilberg are from a very early period, from the 1950s, and after them this fades away until the publication of, in my eyes, a very, very problematic book, but which was embraced by many, and that is Zygmunt Baumann's Modernity and the Holocaust from 1989. And I assume that some of you know this book. But he, to a large extent, based himself on Hilberg's study. I won't go in particulars, but for somebody who looks into footnotes, when you look into the footnotes at Zygmunt Baumann's book, you get into trouble. So he interpreted the Holocaust as a modern genocide and said it was a rare yet significant and reliable test of hidden possibilities of modernity. For him, the issue of modernity was important, and I quote, "It is difficult and probably impossible to arrive at such an idea of genocide with a purpose, a grand vision of a better and a radically different society, without the entrenched practice of medicine, both of medicine proper, aimed at the individual human body, and of its numerous allegorical applications, with its model of health and normality, strategy of separation, and technique of surgery." It is a very interesting observation and perhaps not untrue, but it relates to the idea of medicine in general, as Baumann perceives it within this concept of modernity and its dangers. It does not deal with the realities of medicine in the service of Nazism. And definitely it was not with the functioning of medicine within the Jewish sphere at the time. And he disregards the many dimensions of medicine. Medicine is not one thing, as we all know. It's a family name for a broad variety of professions and attitudes. And then we have, of course, also a development, a major development and stream of research in Holocaust research, which tried to find the path leading to the final solution. And that developed in what we call Täterforschung, perpetrator research, into first 2 major schools that quarreled with each other. That is the intentionalist school, which focused on Hitler and thought that things were predetermined, and that has its origin also in the post-war trials, but it was a top-down process, and the functionalism, which emphasized the bureaucracy and that there was no real goal at the beginning, and things escalated in a zigzag way along the way in a radicalization process. And Raoul Hilberg, whom I mentioned, had a middle position between them. I would say, although he wrote earlier than the major development in the functionalist school of research. In the 1990s, but what I would like to emphasize is, and that is very important, that they were both schools and Hilberg were interested in a way, they had a tunnel view because they wanted to find the path to the final solution. And therefore they focused on decision making and what happened mainly in the bureaucracy, and did not look at the larger picture, I would say. So if we look at the basic approaches, and we can see that they all focus on the final solution as being a final stage of a development, its ultimate peak. The issue that scholars thought that should be explained was the processes leading to the point in time when the final solution crystallized as a program. As a consequence, scholars have been captive of the attempt to neatly integrate a variety of anti-Jewish actions, such as economic persecution, legal segregation, ghettoization, and more, into an apparently logical development of a consecutive and causational process that led to the ultimate apex. This kind of understanding is emphasized even more in recent times due to the impact of genocide studies. The definition of the Shoah is, in these studies, usually restricted to a definition of the genocide of the Jews, and we add to that the changed focus to the killings in Eastern Europe. That is the development since the 1990s, and here two studies are relevant. I say they are very influential. One is the book by Mark Mazower, Hitler's Empire, and Timothy Snyder's book Bloodlands. Many of you have heard about it and so on, but they understand the Holocaust as being the genocide of the Jews, and that is part of either the will or the search for an empire in the East, or part of a area that Snyder calls Bloodlands, which never existed, was not a geographical or political entity. On the other hand, and that is important, I think, scholars neglected or disregarded a whole set of activities that could not be interwoven into the process leading to the murder campaign. Consequently, there is an interesting situation that we have a considerable number of partial studies which reveal an enormously broad range of anti-Jewish activities in the Third Reich, but these activities are not included and interwoven into that section of research that attempts to present a comprehensive picture of the event. A picture which has at its backbone the narrative of the evolution towards the final solution. Medicine and health care is one of these neglected activities. When it is mentioned in these comprehensive analyses, and as said already, only a minority of scholars do so, it appears either in a very vague and general way, or as a subsection of the implementation of other factors. For instance, the horrible health condition in ghettos are presented as a byproduct of the ghettoization process. And the medical experiments on life unworthy of life in Auschwitz and elsewhere are presented as a criminal act carried out on people who are about to be murdered anyhow. So this leads me now to the final part, and that is what is the Shoah, what's the Holocaust, and what is the core of it. And here I have my present, and maybe we can hand it out to people. And this is something brand new that will be in the publication that I mentioned will appear in 2 weeks. So here I come to to my argument that there is a need to reformulate our understanding of the anti-Jewish campaign that we call the Holocaust. So for me, the Holocaust is not the genocide of the Jews, but is the entire anti-Jewish campaign from its very beginning, the Holocaust or Shoah. I do not claim that scholarship until now had it entirely wrong. No, not at all. I learned from it, and I think it's very important. Some of the discussion, by the way, you could see only in a publication 2 weeks ago, a review of Christopher Browning of a book by Peter Longerich on the final solution, on the Wannsee conference, actually, which was not a conference, but that's another issue. But I think that our understanding of the goal of the Nazi anti-Jewish project should slightly be altered. So in view of the enormous body of research in the past 3 decades, I propose a redefinition of the Shoah, which you now have in your hands, and that is that the vision that stood at the heart of the entire Nazi anti-Jewish enterprise was that the world, the universe, should be totally cleansed from what the Nazi Weltanschauung perceived as the Jüdischen Geist, the Jewish spirit. The idea of the Jewish Geist is not Yiddishkeit as we understand it in the Jewish tradition, but was the idea of human equality, an idea originating, according to this, in Judaism that polluted, haunted, and undermined the world. In Christianity, liberalism, socialism, communism, Bolshevism, capitalism, democracy, music, art, literature, and more. Because it ran counter to the natural principle of hierarchy. Hitler proved to be a most successful transformational leader, and transformational leader is a sociological concept which I will not explain here. A leader who has the ability to activate people to such a degree that it changes society. People from all over German society were ready to be activated by the Nazi vision and participate in its anti-Jewish enterprise because the ingredients of this vision were not entirely new and they were usable, especially because of the economic and post-World War I mental crisis which destabilized German and European society. There is more, but I think this is important. Unfortunately, due to time limits, I cannot go into the particulars, yet I believe that the many anti-Jewish activities taken in the entire field of medicine and healthcare, either by professionals, state bureaucrats, self-proclaimed or academically raised and trained racial experts, commissioners of cities in occupied countries, etc., should be situated in this context. If, as an expression of basic agreement with the goal to rebuild Germany and reshape the world, linguistics voluntarily embarked on a campaign to purify the German language from Jewish influence, a de-Judaization. Legal professors and lawyers tried voluntarily to cleanse legal thinking from Jewish ideas. The economic ministries, out of duty, and private corporations voluntarily, intensely worked to expel Jews from economic life. Scientists voluntarily tried to eject supposed Jewish theories from their disciplines, not only in the social sciences, but also in the exact sciences, such as physics, for instance. And lower echelon officials of the Reichsbahn voluntarily proposed solutions to reduce the costs of deportation. Architects provided their expertise to economically plan concentration camps, and I can go on and on. Then physicians, psychologists and psychiatrists, nurses and administrators of medical institutions, and officials in the field of healthcare, as individuals and as a collective, try to do the same in their domain. Many of them voluntarily, beyond anything that they were requested to do or ordered to do. With the help of Darwinist and eugenic theories, they even had a professional justification to do so. And thus they, with their tools and their views, medicalized the Jewish and racial problem. Medicalization meaning here the defining of political or social issues as medical problems and relating to them in medical terms. From this perspective, the contribution of the entire medical profession or professions in Germany to the rapid change of German society immediately after the Nazi rise to power in 1933 was considerable. And I think this is very important. We are doing research now for 8 decades on the Nazi period. But it was, and the whole regime existed for 12 years and 98 days, which is almost nothing in historical times, right? And something enormous erupted. And this cannot be explained by via the venue of bureaucracy and orders and so on. We know all what a bureaucracy means, right? How long we wait for something to be done. And if there is no budget, then it is not done, right? But here where things were done, there was never a budget for the final solution. There was never a exact budget, and so the funds for the final solution were given or were taken by the various institutions involved. They found the funding for it, and it did not come from the state as such. And this is only one example, and there are a lot of other things. So to understand what happened in such a short time is precisely that it is not a bureaucratic event, that there was a large participation and that there were local initiatives from below that enabled it. And it was an event in which large sections of the population went into were ready to join the effort, the overall effort. So Gerhard Wagner, the co-founder and since 1932 the leader of the National Socialist German Physicians Federation and the first Reichsärzteführer, Reichsdoctors leader, explained that, and I quote, "In the past being a physician was a private matter of the individual. Today this has changed. Being a physician means serving the German people. As such, the physician was also an engineer and biological soldier. As Hans Reiter, department director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Experimental Therapy, explained already in 1933. And indeed, as can be seen from the practical behavior of a large percentage of those active in the German medical sector throughout the period, many individual doctors and professional health organizations embraced this view, and as the total removal of the Jews, that is Entfernung überhaupt, that is an expression from Hitler's first political writing from September 1919. So the total removal of Jews and the Jewish spirit were at the heart of the battle to be fought in order to create a healthy future for Germany and the world. They used their expertise and tools to achieve that goal in their domain, medicine. There's another aspect, of course, to the topic of medicine during the Holocaust, which I already mentioned, the encounter of perpetrator medicine with Jewish medicine. Precisely those physicians who served the perpetration machinery at the daily level also made use of Jewish doctors, thus expressing the esteem which they had for the professional abilities of those doctors. German authorities also counted on the ability of Jews to establish their own health care systems in ghettos, for instance, which would be good enough to prevent epidemics. That is, there was also appreciation of and admiration for Jews in the field of medicine. And it is not just looking down on the Jews, but also admiring the Jews. But this is only the beginning. We can go on, and I'll finish here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Michman. It's interesting to note in your handout, this is my first time at least, seeing that the definition of the Holocaust, within the definition of your definition of the Holocaust, there is the terminology lives unworthy of life. So you're giving us food for thought, I'm sure, among the historians. We will have 10 minutes now for questions.
Yes, my name is Volker Rölke. I'm part of the Lancet Commission. Thank you very much for this really great presentation, and both synthesis and also in a way revision of many conceptions about the relation between medicine and the Holocaust. I have one question of understanding, which is connecting to a debate we had within the Commission, and one further question. So the first question relates to the commonly found concept, also in historiography since the 1980s, that there was a linear causal sort of sequence of events from eugenics, racial hygiene, euthanasia, Holocaust. And at least implicitly, I think you have answered that question. Was it like that, or was it much more complex? And was can the Holocaust simply understood as a medicalized genocide, or is there a broader perspective necessary? And I think you have, in fact, answered this question. But perhaps you can spell it out more explicitly, relating to this sequence. And the other question relates to the issue of the persecution of non-Jewish groups, like psychiatric patients and disabled people, and Sinti and Roma, for instance. So how do they fit into your general picture? Because I mean, there was not only, there was of course, I mean, this story which you're referring to, but there was also the persecution and killing of Sinti and Roma and psychiatric patients and so on. Thank you.
Okay, I'll start with the second question, perhaps. What I gave you is a part of the definition. The definition is even longer. So I include also the aspect of the Jewish medicine. It will be in the final product, which will be available hopefully in 2 weeks, right? So what I say also that it intertwines with various other developments, right? And when we speak about conceptualization, we try to form a picture which puts demarcations, right? But we know in life everything intertwines. We have all kinds of things. So I just give you a interesting example that until 1994 there was a picture of a Jewish child in the Netherlands, which was an iconic picture of the Holocaust in the Netherlands. And it turned out it was a picture of a Roma girl who was also deported and murdered in Auschwitz, right? So we have these various schools and ideas, right? Even when we speak about racism, recently a very important book in my eyes came out by Amit Warshitsky. He wrote also several articles where you can see that already in the 1920s and later in the 1930s there were quite influential German racial philosophers who did not believe in the biological truth of it, but they spoke about a spiritual race, right? So, and then the question is, of course, so you have different conceptualizations of what race is in the Third Reich. Of course, those bureaucrats who made definitions and they were implemented and so on had one thing. Then you had the researchers, and then you had others. So even the idea of racial theory is not one. And that is very important to see. And therefore, also what you asked about the linear development, right? I think there are these connections, right? But they're not always linear, right? And so they go in different directions and are implemented in various ways. There are people who also do the experimentations and go further and further, right? To see what can be done or what is allowed according to the theory. And there are others who have, even if they are complicit, they have at a certain moment a barrier, right? can be because if it's in psychiatry, because in the family there is somebody who is retarded or so and things. So you have these things. We are speaking about the people, right? And another aspect which I did not mention, but I think is very important in general for understanding this period is, again, it is such a short period, right? And in this short period, Germany expanded to almost all over Europe. And they needed people from all over to be bureaucrats and to carry out the various activities. So you get a farmer from Austria, from I don't know where, who is suddenly the commander of a city in Eastern Europe, right? He was not a full Nazi, trained Nazi and so on, but he served the regime. So we can see that a lot of things are coming in, and in this, and therefore, from the aspect of racial theory, you have other groups that are unworthy of life, right? and therefore, when I speak about this, it's not about the aspect of suffering, right? And that's very important to emphasize. But you don't have, regarding any other group than the Jews, a term like das Weltjudentum. You don't have das Weltzigeunertum or das Welthomosexualtum and so on. You have das Weltjuden or the Nationales Judentum, right? And der jüdische Geist, right? Which has its origins also before 1933, right? But, and therefore it was juxtaposed, that is the hierarchical natural principle versus the unnatural idea of equality. And therefore in Hitler's eyes, but also by others, Rosenberg and so on, capitalism and communism are not different. It looks like they are opposed, but they both are based on the principle of human equality, which is unnatural. Therefore, they can be thrown all into one bag. And so this whole conceptualization is very important. And it was, and according to their view, and this is another book by Alon Confino, I don't know, World Without Jews, where you can see that already in 1933, for instance, Hitler said that 1933 is opposed to 1789, the French Revolution, right? So we have these two poles which are opposed, and the origin of, and the carriers, the HIV-like carriers of the idea of equality are the Jews. So in the end, they have to be exorcised or exterminated, but it's not enough. It's also the books, right? And the influence in law, language, and so on. When the Deutsche Sprachverein in 1934 embarks on an Entjudungskampf to purify the German language from the Jewish influence, the question is, what do they mean, right? And does this lead to the final solution? No, it's something larger. And so we have, what I propose is to look at the whole picture and see that it goes in various directions, right? And professionals in the various professions implement the general idea according to understanding in their field, according to their expertise. And not everything leads to the final solution. There is a development towards a final solution, which is also not linear like Hilberg thought or others, right? So in the field of medicine and in the general conceptualization, we should look at it in a different way. And I say there is a kind of volcano eruption of energy, and that is a psychological aspect, which is very important of the period, right? That so many people were ready to join the project, right? And not only in Germany, also in other places, right? So, okay. I hope I answered your question.
Okay. Sari, welcome. And you have the privilege of asking a question. Go ahead. Yeah.
It's great to be here, sort of. Coming in from Los Angeles, great to see you, Dan. You left off right before exploring the Jewish medicine part. You said, you know, and then there's the Jewish medicine, but I'll stop here, essentially. I was wondering if you could define what you mean by Jewish medicine. Is it an all-encompassing category, or so is it fair to say there was a Jewish medicine, or is it more complicated? Thank you.
You want another lecture?
I've got the time. I'm up. It's 2:34. Let's keep it going.
The elevator pitch,
I
please.
don't intend to do it, but it's of course you can Jews in the field of medicine, I would say that is so. It also is very broad, and it's different in different places, right? But it is of course how Jewish professionals react and function within this context against the background of a long-delay development, right? And Avi Ori has dealt with it and others, so you cannot understand what happened in ghettos in Poland without being acquainted with the pre-1939 developments and how Jewish medical institutions functioned there and so on, which explains why in other places where you don't have such a background, right, it was different. Right? And then you can relate, of course, also to traditions in, let's say, in Jewish history regarding medicine, right? You know, the joke about the grandmother who's plays with the two little grandchildren and say to the neighbor, here are the physician and the lawyer. I don't know yet who will be what, but these are the two professions that we have in Jewish culture for centuries. So you have to look at them, but in different places it is different. And then you have not only in the countries, but also in different camps. When you relate to Bergen-Belsen, for instance, for the Austauschlager, it's different than people who are urged to work in Auschwitz and so on. But so it is also a family name for a lot of other practices. But and there still has a lot to be done, because for most of the countries, this aspect is almost untouched, right? Almost untouched. You have a little bit, or you have about Poland here and there, then you have a little bit about Germany, about the Netherlands and so on. But I cannot recall, for instance, one study on Jewish doctors in Belgium. Right? And this is just an example there, but so there is a lot to be done.
I think we have room for one more question, and Matt.
So I want to dig a tiny bit more into this question of did medical professional involvement lead to the Holocaust? Because it strikes me that I mean, number one, of course, the answer is it's more complicated. That's sort of a given. But number two, that strikes me as being multiple questions wrapped into one, some of which may have different answers that might have different implications. So there's the question of, did medical involvement make the Holocaust inevitable? That's a different question than what would have happened had medical professionals acted differently, which is also different from the question of was collaboration of medical professionals necessary, if not sufficient? And I think for our purposes, in terms of teaching about this, if the answer to all of those is basically the same, which is it's complicated, and it's not a linear thing, and it was a zigzag, and who knows, and that's a little disempowering. Because we would like to believe that medicine can be a force for good in the world, and in societies that are going off the rails, a coherent medical profession with a solid view of its core ethics might have made a difference. And I would like that to be the message. But I also don't want to be stupid and naive. So tell me if you see the answers to those questions as all sort of the same, it's complicated, and who knows what might have happened. Or is there an argument to be made for the medical profession could have acted differently and it might have made a difference?
I'll give first a short answer. Yes, it made a difference in that part of the medical professions, right? We had others, we had linguists and economics and so on. So we have many participants. So to say that without medical ideas it would be impossible, right? No, because if we think that about 2.5 million Jews and others were murdered in Eastern Europe without doctors, right? In killing pits and so on. This is without the medical team. But Auschwitz and other places not. And the earlier years, for me it's very important, versus an attitude which is very dominant in genocide research, that we start in 1941 was the final solution. No, the 1930s are very important, right? And then when you, for instance, look at Denmark, you know that the medical professionals, the doctors were the major force in the rescue of the. And there is a PhD at Bar-Ilan University written by a physician who worked on it, and he looked also in the mode of education in the medical schools in Denmark, right? So I think, but here is something, and I'll stick to the things that it is complicated, right? It is always complicated, but it doesn't mean that everything goes, right? And there is no explanation, no, right? So you have to look at the circumstances, and then of course the issue there is a general atmosphere, right, which happened in various countries and in various situations, and we are now encountering what is happening in Europe, right? And before that in other places, and that what drives a society, what is the dominant drive of a certain society is very important. And therefore, let's say the more you can go in the direction of the democratic background in Danish society was important, although it is complicated, because there were volunteers for the SS who in Denmark, who participated, for instance, in Bobruisk in the murder of Jews. So it's not all the Danes and it's not all the physicians, but a large part of the physicians in Denmark played an important role in the rescue, right? And you don't have such a thing in Germany and Austria, or even in other countries, right? So there is an atmosphere. There is the education at school, and here comes in what you say. It's important to see what played a role in the education of those doctors, right? And what are the limits that they were not ready to trespass. Right? That is very important. And here comes in, return to Volker, what he said, eugenics are very important. Of course, when you think about social problems in medical terms, right, then also doctors can change their view of what they should do. Right? And we have these ethical questions going all the time. That is euthanasia, right, is a question in all societies all over, right? And therefore, I think it's important to discuss it at least and show that it's complicated, but that is not an excuse not to do anything and not to learn from it, to go and to return to Hippocrates' basic definition, right? So.
Well, thank you very much. We would like to go on, but we cannot. I hope you'll stay with us for the discussion that will come up in a moment.